My name is Eric Israelian, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this program this afternoon. I wanted to thank everybody from the Promise Armenian Institute and the Promise Institute for Human Rights, as well as our UCLA Health team and the entire university for collaborating and rallying together to provide assistance for the humanitarian effort towards Artsakh and Nagorno Karabakh in Armenia. I just wanted to take a few moments and really express my appreciation for all of you joining as well, because this has been a difficult time in the world and has been a particularly difficult time for Armenians around the world. And it gives me a great sense of pride to see how our university, UCLA, as a leading public university around the world, has taken this leadership position in our community as well. And from the chancellor to vice chancellors to faculty, students, staff, and our entire Los Angeles community, I have seen UCLA become playing a central role in this effort. And it again fills me with a sense of pride. And I have deep gratitude for everyone who has been participating in this effort. And we hope that we can encourage others to join us as well. When we started, both the Promise Armenian Institute and the Promise Institute for Human Rights, we did not anticipate this kind of situation, yet this is exactly why we have these institutes and we have them at UCLA. And it is really encouraging to me to see how many people have rallied, and you're going to learn a lot about their efforts, but I just can't thank them enough. There's too many people to thank. But from the moment we wanted to pull together an effort, there was absolutely no hesitation, and you're going to learn a lot about what these dedicated and brave individuals have been doing. And I just want to thank you all again for participating, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. As I keep telling people, we are just getting started. We intend to be contributing to this effort for years to come, and hopefully not towards humanitarian catastrophe, but really towards fulfilling the vision that we laid out years ago. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Israelian. And my name is Asla Bali. I'm the faculty director at the Promise Institute for Human Rights here at UCLA School of Law. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome all of our panelists and also welcome this large audience to this event that is enormously important to us. We've watched with great dismay over the course of the last 6 and more months as the situation has deteriorated dramatically and ultimately culminated in a brutal war and the consequences of this war, which we'll hear about on this panel. But we at Promise Institute for Human Rights have been so fortunate to be able to partner with the Promise Armenian Institute, partner with Dr. Israelian, and really formulate a strategy for bringing the human rights dimensions of this conflict and these circumstances to the fore, and strategizing how to move forward and how to build and strengthen resources for the protection of human rights in this context. So this panel, together with the many other programs that we have envisioned and the research that we're undertaking in this area, is just the beginning of what, as Dr. Israelian has just said, we hope will build into a broad, far-reaching program of engagement on these questions, specifically for Artsakh, Nagorno Karabakh, and Armenia. But with that, I do want to turn to my partner at the Promise Armenian Institute to carry on with our introductions and welcomes.
Thank you, Asla. Greetings and a warm welcome from me as well. My name is Professor Haig Aintablian, and it's my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to also welcome you to our first joint panel. This co-hosted with the Promise Institute for Human Rights at the UCLA Law School. This panel on addressing the humanitarian crisis in Artsakh, Nagorno Karabakh is designed to provide perspectives by several of our UCLA healthcare specialists who have recently traveled to Armenia and Artsakh for humanitarian and medical outreach during and after the war that was initiated by Azerbaijan during the COVID-19 pandemic. Commentary on their observations and the human rights implications will be provided by Kate Mackintosh, the Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights, with important additional perspectives shared by our esteemed moderator, Professor Alina Dorian, Associate Dean of the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, who herself has extensive professional experience in Artsakh, Nagorno Karabakh, and Armenia. And let me note our tremendous gratitude for the leadership and support of much of this humanitarian outreach provided by Dr. Haig Aintablian through UCLA Health and our Promise Armenian Institute. And now I'll turn the program over to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Alina Dorian, Associate Dean of the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Dr. Dorian has been a faculty member for many years in the Fielding School's Community Health Sciences Department, and for over 25 years, she has been working in Artsakh as a frozen conflict area to address the needs of refugees and internally displaced populations. Professor Dorian.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you to everybody, and a special thank you to Dr. Haig Aintablian for really helping us spearhead a lot of the efforts following the war. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure, it's an honor actually to be here today, to be given this opportunity to provide some opening remarks, to set the context about an issue, about a place, Artsakh, that is very close to my heart and has been a great part of my professional career. As Anne so kindly stated, I've had the good fortune to work in Artsakh for the last 26 years, mostly focusing on public health programming. To understand the poignant relevance of today's panel, I just want to quickly provide some context. During the formation of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, as boundaries were being drawn up to create the Soviet republics, Nagorno Karabakh, with its ethnic Armenian majority, was one of many enclaves that were pieced out and placed into republics where they became a minority. Karabakh, however, was designated an autonomous oblast under the Soviet constitution, which provided it with certain rights. Fast forward to Gorbachev's reign and around the time of Soviet movement towards collapse, in 1988, Nagorno Karabakh cited its right under the Soviet constitution as an autonomous oblast to secede from Azerbaijan SSR and join Armenia SSR. As you can imagine, this declaration of secession and autonomy was not very well received by the ruling Azerbaijani government, and hence a bloody war commenced. During this protracted war, in 1991, Nagorno Karabakh decided instead to declare its independence as a freestanding, self-governing republic. The war raged on till 1994, where there was finally a ceasefire agreement enacted. Unfortunately, this ceasefire or frozen conflict situation continued to the present. Even with the international mediating body known as the Minsk Group, negotiations failed to reach a lasting resolution. And this is very important because despite the past 26 years of economic, social, and democratic growth and development within Artsakh, there was no substantive diplomatic movement in the resolution of its status and no recognition on the international stage of Artsakh's right to self-determination. That's what brings us to today. It's important to think about international humanitarian law, rights and privileges that are reserved for groups and countries based on their status. Furthermore, for 26 years, this ceasefire agreement was violated with episodic clashes which culminated, unfortunately, on September 27, 2020. The latest war bore heavy casualties and damages that were sustained both from a brutal ground war, as well as the heavy use of drones, cluster munitions, and ballistic missiles. Further, as Anne stated, the war began amidst the mounting global health coronavirus crisis and ignored the appeals that were made by the UN Secretary General for all countries to institute a global ceasefire during the pandemic. So that brings us to today, our esteemed panelists that will discuss their involvement on the ground, providing humanitarian assistance during this recent war in Artsakh, and our very own Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights, who will shed some light drawing on the international law framework governing these contexts. My dear participants, in a moment, I'll be honored to turn over the platform to our esteemed panelists, and I'll introduce them individually as they take this virtual podium. We're going to try to keep a good bit of time in the end for Q&A. So please feel free to go ahead, type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to direct them to our panelists once they have presented. And now, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Haig Aintablian, who is a resident physician in emergency medicine at the UCLA Medical Center, a graduate of the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix, obtaining a BA in biology and an MS in molecular genetics and biochemistry from the University of Southern California. He has numerous research publications, presentations, has conducted research with NASA's Johnson Space Center, and served on multiple editorial boards, and is the founder of the Differential Diagnosis newsletter, which boasts over 4,000 monthly readers. In 2020, he was awarded the National Resident of the Year Award by the American Academy of Emergency Medicine. I would now like to invite Dr. Haig Aintablian.
Hey, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen in a little bit, and we can, once I'm allowed permission to do so, and then I'll kind of show some of the things that I saw in Artsakh. Here we go. Put this in presenter view. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about some of the things that I personally saw in my trip to Armenia, and a lot of these things, before we start, I want to give a warning because they can be very graphic. You're going to see some things with regards to the human body that some physicians have difficulty looking at. I put these out there so that we kind of get an understanding of the trauma that our soldiers and our civilians kind of went through. If at any point you feel like it's too much, feel free to look away from the screen. But I just wanted to let you know that there are going to be some graphic images. Some images are of actual patients in Armenia who were able to give me consent. Others I've substituted with similar images, so there are no laws to be broken. So I think we all know where Karabakh is, where Artsakh is, but for those that don't, it's right adjacent to Armenia and in a flank with Azerbaijan. And this was essentially the combat zone, that entire red area. Timeline on September 27th was around the time when the war started. I initially was kind of looking at how things were going. I thought this was going to be like a 1 or 2 day long conflict. And then quickly I realized that this thing was not going to end anytime soon. I immediately went to my program administrators and I told them that I really wanted to go because I knew that they would need help. And they graciously allowed me to go to Armenia to go help. November 5th, after collecting a bunch of supplies from generous anyone, essentially, I took what I had, shipped a bunch by cargo as well, and went to Armenia. Me and Shant shared the same airplane ride there, surprisingly, and we kind of got underway. And now we start with some of the things that I saw. So here are a handful of cases. So before we start, let's talk a little bit about what a cluster bomb is, because a lot of people talk about this and a lot of people don't seem to know what a cluster bomb is. A cluster bomb is essentially a warhead that has multiple little bombs within it. It's used to kind of wipe a large area of a population with munitions, as opposed to a regular warhead, which is a very specific, accurate kind of way to attack. A cluster bomb is like a blanket of munitions. It has no direct target, which is why they're seen as dirty bombs, because they tend to affect civilians very badly as well. This is one of the hospitals in Yerevan that I went to immediately. This is where some of the most like horrific injuries that I saw were stationed after they made it out of the war zone. So this was case one. This was a young male brought in by airlift with a significant bomb injury to his left face, anterior chest, abdomen, and bilateral lower extremities, both of his legs. He had an arterial injury to his left arm and a pneumothorax on the left as well, which we'll go into in a second. He received a chest tube and went to the OR for laparoscopy and laparotomy. So these are the types of injuries that we see with cluster munitions. It's just like a splatter of different shrapnel that will affect anything that it kind of gets in contact with. A normal chest x-ray, for example, of what this thing could cause. A normal chest x-ray is on the left. You see the heart right in the middle. A pneumothorax is whenever your lung deflates. And in this case, a tension pneumothorax is something where it pushes everything to one side. A very, very traumatic injury that requires us to do some significant procedures, some of which are shown here. I know there's a lot of blood in this image, but this is the kind of stuff that we were doing constantly in these hospitals. Putting in central access to make sure that we can give them blood, making sure we were monitoring them accurately. Very grotesque images. Other examples of bomb injuries that I saw, this is another patient that we saw. This was a cluster bomb munition that tore through his flank, as well as led to a bunch of smoldering pieces of metal in his thigh. Again, very grotesque, and I apologize for some of these images, but it's just to show you kind of the severity that we saw. White phosphorus was another thing that I had never experienced before going to Armenia. And this is another kind of dirty weapon. It's phosphorus in chemistry, you learn, is something that when you take it in its elemental form and you just expose it to oxygen, it'll burn without stopping. You can't do much to stop it. You can't douse it in water. You really cannot stop this thing until it stops itself. It burns at 2,700 degrees Celsius or 5,000 Fahrenheit. The pieces of phosphorus that once they start touching the skin, they'll fizzle through until it reaches bone and it just settles there and tries to fizzle on that as well. If you don't die from the white phosphorus injury yourself, you tend to die from hyperphosphatemia afterwards, where you have too much phosphorus in your blood, and this leads to a bunch of issues, acid-base disturbances and cardiac arrhythmias. This was one of the hospitals at Vardanis where this patient came from. And this is what a white phosphorus injury looks like. It looks like you're making Swiss cheese of the skin. This was a young male also brought in due to white phosphorus injuries. And it was so grotesque that you could see his right lung because it had penetrated through his flesh enough where you reached the thoracic cavity. On November 11th, Russia kind of came in and they essentially stopped the war in some ways after 2 failed ceasefire attempts. A lot of political things were going on in Armenia around this time. I remember the protests while I was there. And I was stationed at this ICU in Yerevan, and we had a patient, a 32-year-old male, who after 4 days in the ICU started developing this thing. He had a bullet wound in his gluteal area, in his butt area, that ended up becoming significantly painful and letting this soap-like discharge come out. It was this really, really significant injury, and ultimately he ended up with this thing called necrotizing fasciitis, which ended up taking his life 24 hours later. The next 2 images are probably the most grotesque. Just if you're not able to handle this, you might want to turn away. But this is kind of what necrotizing fasciitis looks like. It's this infection that kind of boils into the skin, and you need to take these people to the OR immediately and start them on pretty heavy antibiotics to kill the bug, or else the bug, this flesh-eating bacteria, will eat away at the skin. Ultimately, what happens is this: you end up with no flesh left, because after debridement, it's eaten essentially most of it, leading to all this exposed skin and, you know, this type of trauma. November 11th, when the war ended, you know, we took our losses, especially those that were kind of working in these hospitals, and we were all in this depressed state. The entire country was. It took about a day or 2, but afterwards, a few of us started to help some of the Artsakh refugees that started to flood into Armenia because they were about to give up their homes, and we helped establish a few free health clinics for some of these incredible people. I didn't know how different the Artsakh dialect was from regular Armenian, but it was an incredible experience to see these people and to be able to help them. This was in one of the casinos where they were housing some of the refugees, and they built a primary care clinic, which I ended up helping in, and it was super rewarding. And then afterwards, November 17th is when I started to head back to my homeland, or my home, I should say, here, not my homeland, but a very bittersweet end to an incredible, like, shearing of the soul. This was something that really brought me close to my people, and also something that showed me some of the grotesque parts of war, as well as some of the inhumanities that exist in what happened in this war. Some of the things that I would have never seen, I saw. White phosphorus, as well as the cluster munitions, and so many other human rights violations. These are some pictures that I and others took with me. This was us going into Artsakh, some of the tanks along the way. This is a photo from one of my friends of a sniper from the Artsakh side. This was one of the churches that had collapsed or had been bombed, and this was a person lighting a candle there. Some injured soldier being rushed to the hospital. This is a very well-known picture to many of us of this grandma holding this fairly large rifle, trying to protect her home. And of course, some of the sadness after the fact, some of the burials. It was a very, very tragic experience. But ultimately, and this is a really powerful image, an Artsakh just going about his daily life with a bomb that's not detonated right next to him. But yeah, I honestly, from this experience, I took home a lot about what it means to be Armenian and what it means to be alive. We don't know what it feels like when you're scared of the sky. I had never thought I would have that feeling, to be scared of the sky, to not know whether something was going to just fall from the sky and blow you up. And that's what many of the soldiers, some of the sentiments that they shared was their fear of the sky. In any case, this was my experience. I know that I shared a lot with regards to some of the tragic things that have happened to our soldiers and our people, but it's just to put things into perspective. Some of these difficult images to see should prompt you to understand just how much these people went through. And on that note, I'd like to turn it back over to you, Alina.
Thank you so much, Haig. Yeah, maybe you want to exactly stop sharing screen. Perfect. First of all, thank you very much for that. And I always, coming back to Karabakh again, you know, I got married on Karabakh, so always the idea of translating Karabakh into Armenian in my family was always kind of an interesting thing. So I agree. Thank you. Now I have the esteemed honor to present Dr. Salpy Akaragian, President and founder of the Armenian International Medical Fund and Emeritus of UCLA Health's Director of the International Nursing Program and Nurse Credentialing. She received a BS, an MS, and a PhD in nursing from the UCLA School of Nursing. She was the US Partner Representative for USAID AIHA grants from 1995 to 2004, directing multiple healthcare projects in Armenia. In 2004, she established the Cochlear Implant Center in Yerevan. She's the founder and the first president of the Armenian American Nurses Association in California, and in 1996 facilitated the formation of the Armenian Nurses Association in Armenia. She served on the California Board of Registered Nursing as a board member, has received several regional and national awards, and in 2014, she was awarded the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Salpy Akaragian.
Thank you so much, Alina, for the kind introduction. Greetings to you all. My part will focus on the obstacles and challenges that we've faced during the war, and then we're currently facing in the post-war era. I will specifically address the hearing loss that we're seeing in the soldiers and some civilians. So soon after the war started, Armenian International Medical Fund and Armenian Medical International Committee partnered to begin procuring and sending medical items to Armenia and Artsakh. We had a number of obstacles to get the shipment out to Armenia on a timely basis. Believe it or not, they were held in the country of Georgia. Our first shipment, which left maybe in a week after the war started, didn't get there 4 weeks after while the war is going on. Meantime, quite a few philanthropists from LA, they chartered planes to get the shipment out, and they got there much faster than the ones that we had originally shipped with the first shipment. So that was very devastating to all of us because we're rushing, hurrying to get things done, but meantime, they're blocking. The second obstacle we faced is that writing funds to Armenia. We needed to get money out there to purchase some things. And again, country of Georgia held our funds from the AIM Foundation in Georgia. It took us weeks to get the money back, and we only got it back because the US bank intervened. So my second focus is going to be on the post-war, which is right now we're facing. As Alina said, we've been doing cochlear implant surgeries in Armenia for the last 15 years in Yerevan, Armenia, but we're serving all the regions, including Artsakh. If we had over 150 cases, we have a number of them from Artsakh that they have traveled to Yerevan to get the implant. In November 2020, it was our 20th medical mission for the foundation. Not only we operated on 13 children who've been waiting since the beginning of the year because of the COVID, we couldn't travel out. We had no choice at that point. As soon as the war stopped and Dr. Isham and I could go to the mission, we took off to Armenia during the Thanksgiving week, because that's when Dr. Isham is able to leave the patients or have less surgeries at UCLA and be able to travel. So at that time, not only we operated on those 13 young children and placing an implant, Dr. Ishiyama, who's a well-known otologist, ear surgeon at UCLA Health, operated on a soldier that was first time done in Armenia. He orchestrated 3 other highly specialized surgeons in Armenia at Yerevan Medical Center to repair a facial nerve damage that Robert had received from the shrapnel. So sad to hear this young guy, 20-year-old Robert, only survivor from the team of 6 other peers that died in front of him. The stories is just mind-boggling. And if you want to learn about him or about the surgery, we have videotape posted on our website, Armenian International Medical website. You can go and look at it. To illustrate the bigger picture, according to our ear, nose, and neck doctors in Armenia, just listen to this, 80% of our soldiers coming back from Armenia, from Artsakh war, coming back to Armenia, have a hearing loss. That's a huge number, 80%. And from which, again, with the help of Dr. Ishiyama, when we were in Armenia for the 20th medical mission, we began other surgeries, and over 100 soldiers already had their tympanic membrane perforation repaired. So we have begun the work, and we have lots of work to do. But the worst news that I can't even internalize this yet, that over 50 soldiers have totally lost hearing both ears, which means that they are now need a cochlear implant to regain their hearing. So, and I'm not even going to address the hearing aid issue because we have another team which is addressing that. And obviously there's going to be quite a number of soldiers who are going to need a hearing aid on one side or both sides, but the ones who have totally lost hearing are the ones who are going to need cochlear implants. So what is happening right now, historically, when you look at the literature, you see that soldiers, when they come back from a war, the first thing is for them to take care of the acute care problems. They go for head surgeries, they go to abdominal surgeries, or whatever, broken bones, and then they start focusing on hearing issues. That's why right now we are seeing the numbers, and it's going to be more and more in the next few months. So to just kind of give you a little detailed information about the implants, the foundation, when every year we do anywhere from 10 to 15 cases, we spend about $200,000 per mission for the implants. Our work is voluntarily, including Dr. Ishiyama's time, but the implants are expensive. So just imagine, we're now adding another 50 cases. So we're going to be well over $1 million of expenses. But in closing, what I want to say that even though we're going to face financial challenges, no question about it, but I'm confident that with perseverance, resilience, and help of many, many people surrounding us here all over the world, including Armenia, of course, we'll get over these difficult times. After all, we're obligated and committed to do the impossible for our beloved and extremely courageous soldiers and citizens of Armenia and Artsakh. Thank you. And I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Alina.
Great, thank you so much, Salpy. And I want to add that you've also done a lot of work in helping us coordinate all of the humanitarian supplies and aid that we've been sending, even with us through Operation Armenia at the UCLA side, in getting it to Armenia. And we're very grateful for all of that work, Salpy. And now, I see him, Shant. It is my privilege to now introduce Shant Shekherdimian, Associate Professor of Pediatric Surgery at UCLA. He's actively involved in various initiatives in Armenia's healthcare sector, including efforts to improve postgraduate medical education, to improve quality and programming in pediatric hospitals, and to develop multidisciplinary care teams. Shant serves as an advisor to Armenia's Ministry of Health and is currently a Fulbright scholar researching the feasibility of cancer screening programs in Armenia. I'd like to turn it over to my very humble friend, Dr. Shant Shekherdimian.
Thank you, Alina, and thanks to my colleagues who have outlined many of the realities on the ground that were taking place during this 6-week war. So I'll try to take a little bit of a different perspective and maybe talk about some of the reasons why the outcomes, at least on the medical side, were what they were. If you compare the two Artsakh wars with regards to number of casualties and the timing or the length of the war, it's obvious that there's a big discordance between those two, and that this one was much more severe than the first war. And as Haig had alluded, a lot of that had to do with the epidemiology of the injuries and the different types of injuries that were seen. The first war was primarily ground, various sort of variations of hand-to-hand combat, or combat that involved machine guns and or artillery. This war and the injuries that we saw were completely different, in that a vast majority of the injuries we saw had to do with blast injuries and the use of larger bombs that were using the assistance of drone capabilities, as well as these cluster munitions. And as you can imagine, the effects of that and the severity of these injuries was much higher than what the local medical system had seen during the first war. If a patient came in 20, 30 years ago with an injury, it was likely to be an isolated gunshot wound injury or a smaller blast injury from the lighter weapons. Whereas this time around, the injuries were much more severe, involving many, many body organs, which are very, and that to us on the, on the front lines means that it's very difficult to do what we would call damage control, which is get the patient to a stable place and then ship them out so that they can get more definitive care. That's a lot easier to do when you're dealing with one injury going, say, in and out of the body, as it is with these blast injuries. It also impacted the number of patients that we saw. And so it was not uncommon, for example, for the hospitals in Goris and Vartenis, which are on the Armenia proper side of the border, to go many hours and occasionally even days without seeing a single patient, and then all of a sudden have 2 ambulances drop off 20, 15, or 20 patients all at the same time, which obviously makes it much more difficult to treat these patients concurrently with the resources and the manpower available. The other issue was the logistics. As many know, there were 2 roads that went in and out of Artsakh. At virtually no time during the war were both roads secure. And so it was a choice between alternating between one or the other, which obviously made it a much longer route for the southern region, for example, when the North Road was being used, and vice versa. And there were times where neither roads were at least safe to travel through. And so that was definitely another issue. In Artsakh proper, there was deliberate targeting of hospitals. And the Mardagert hospital was one of the first to be bombed. It was decommissioned for at least the second half of the war. Thereafter, the Stepanakert main hospital was damaged, and then more severely damaged was the maternity hospital in Stepanakert, which was nearly completely destroyed. The other large hospital in the region is the Marduni hospital, which also sustained significant damage. In the Marduni region proper, there was also a lot of issues with electricity and water that made treating patients more difficult. And we also have to keep in mind that even in the hospitals that were not damaged, or for example, particularly the Stepanakert hospital, which many of us have seen, it's new, nice, big, but the capacity to take care of patients was severely limited because the personnel were confined to using the lower basement levels of the hospital rather than the entire hospital for safety and security reasons. We unfortunately did see and bear witness to targeting of doctors and medics. Many physicians and medics lost their life en route to transport injured soldiers and civilians in and out of the war zone and in and out of Artsakh. And as Salpy mentioned, there was significant supply chain issues, both internally because of the geography of Artsakh and Armenia, as well as externally with regards to getting things shipped by land and air, by land and water through Georgia, as well as air, with several airlines canceling cargo flights that were supposed to schedule, ostensibly due to refusal for the flights to go through various airspaces getting into Armenia. The final thing I would just mention, if there is time, is the complexity of taking care of patients that sustain injuries in the middle in a war in the middle of a pandemic. And really the explosion of cases of COVID in Artsakh was very noticeable. The living conditions and the requirements for the population to spend their days in confined quarters in bunkers exponentially sort of accelerated the spread of the virus. And this happened particularly amongst the most susceptible population, namely the elderly. It also had significant downstream effects in that it contributed to the overwhelming of the hospitals taking care of COVID patients in Armenia proper. And there were several weeks where there were long waiting lists, essentially, of patients waiting to get a bed in the hospital, with unfortunately some of them not making it to the hospital as their condition got worse and worse while they were waiting at home. There was a serious shortage of oxygen within the country, which was one of the major rate limiting steps with regards to helping treat COVID patients, not only from Artsakh, but again, because of the system being overwhelmed in Armenia proper as well. Logistically, there were issues as well. As you can imagine, Armenia is a small country. Everybody was somehow affected by the war and by COVID, and it was not unusual to see that we would have shortages in either healthcare personnel or in leadership, because so many of the people that are involved at the hospital, or say the Ministry of Health, were sick with COVID themselves, or had lost a family member to the war and were unable to take their duties. That just in terms of sort of running the entire system, there were serious difficulties and impediments in doing that as well. In any case, I'll just end on a relatively bright note. There are a lot of lessons that have been learned from this that we hope will be useful for the future. There were silver linings, the mobilization of the diaspora. I should note that the mobilization of healthcare workers from Russia and the former Soviet republics was very, very noticeable in Armenia. So many physicians, nurses, and other healthcare personnel had stepped up. We met so many people that were there from the first day of the war and had stayed through all the way to the end, leaving their families and jobs behind. It was a very impressive thing to see. And domestically, as Eric and Anne had mentioned, while our work at the institutes has just gotten started, this definitely accelerated our work and our efforts on the health services side of UCLA with the establishment of the Operation Armenia initiative that really was designed in a way to address the acute humanitarian crises and the needs, but then very readily transform into a more long-term strategic initiative that will collaborate with local institutions in Armenia and contribute to institutional capacity building and health system strengthening in the long term. So with that, hopefully I didn't go over my time period. I'll turn it back to Alina.
Great, thank you so much, Shant. I mean, I think two things just to highlight. It was a really important thing that you highlighted, that even the system response basically was by sort of victims themselves, right? Just everybody in leadership, either through the complex emergency or as well as the pandemic. And I think that sets a really different kind of humanitarian experience in many ways. And then coming back to the other idea that the use of these weapons, indiscriminate use of cluster munitions, missiles, phosphorus munition, it's not only the acute need that we have, but all of these did great destruction of infrastructure and really thinking about mid and long-term planning and how to provide the assistance for both the displaced as well as the returning population. So with that, I want to turn it over to Kate Mackintosh, the Executive Director of the Promise Institute of Human Rights at UCLA Law. She has worked in the fields of human rights, international criminal justice, and the protection of civilians for over 2 decades, both at the headquarters and in the field for international and non-governmental organizations, as well as for international criminal tribunals. For 8 years, she worked with Doctors Without Borders, providing legal and policy advice to operations in over 30 countries around the world, and leading advocacy in support of some of the world's most vulnerable populations. It's my honor to invite Kate Mackintosh.
Alina, thank you very much. And I think, first of all, I'd like to say, as a human being, thank you to all of the doctors and medical staff for your medical work. But I think I'd like to draw attention to the important role that you're playing right now, and that is the role of the doctor as a witness. So as Alina just mentioned, I worked for 8 Doctors Without Borders, MSF as we called them, who explicitly phrased their mission actually in terms of, they see their mission as to save life and alleviate suffering. And they say the 2 ways they can achieve that are through provision of medical aid and bearing witness. So they explicitly see bearing witness as a means to preserve life and alleviate suffering, which is their overall goal. And I've seen close up how valuable that can be in a number of different situations. And I just wanted to give you an example. Back in 1998 in Sierra Leone, MSF was running a surgical program in the main hospital in Freetown. And they suddenly started receiving patients. So the peacekeeping operations would drive patients to the hospital. They started receiving patients whose limbs had been amputated. And over a 12-day period, they treated 29 patients with amputations. And they pulled together a quick, short public report and put it out. And that report led to global awareness. It led to intervention in the conflict, actually, and ultimately the creation of an internationally supported war crimes tribunal. So, I mean, that was like a story with a happy ending. But, you know, the voice of the doctors and what you've seen for your medical work can be really important as a tool to protect human rights. So, my role here is to talk about the international law that regulates those situations that we've just heard about. And of course, behind that question lies another question, which is what can be done? And I imagine that the discussion will touch on that. So the most relevant law then is international humanitarian law, which applies in armed conflict and regulates the actions of the parties to the conflict. And although the rules differ a little bit depending on whether the conflict is state versus state or basically anything else, the principles that are most relevant to the kinds of things you've been describing are basically the same in all conflict situations. So how do those rules apply to what we've heard you describe? Well, a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law is the principle of distinction, meaning that parties must distinguish between civilians and the military, or more specifically between military objectives and everything else. And attacks may only be directed at military objectives. So it's prohibited to target civilians, but for example, wounded military, incapacitated soldiers are also no longer military objectives. So medical staff, hospitals and ambulances are all protected by this rule. And if they're officially working with a party to an international armed conflict, then they may also have additional protections, which would be symbolized then by the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. So that same rule about targeting military objectives is also relevant to the cluster bombs that Haig described and showed us such graphic detail of what those can do. So cluster bombs are prohibited because they spread multiple bomblets indiscriminately over a wide area, as Haig described, making it effectively impossible to target only military objectives. So there is also a treaty which outlaws cluster munitions, which actually just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, but neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan are parties to that treaty. But that doesn't matter, because although the treaty clarifies the prohibition and operationalizes the prohibition exists because of that indiscriminate nature and the inability to target a military objective, which is a customary rule of international humanitarian law. White phosphorus, we also heard about white phosphorus. So white phosphorus is not outlawed per se. It's not an illegal weapon on its own because it can be used in legal ways. So the legal way to use white phosphorus, for example, is to create smoke screens. That's a common use of white phosphorus in conflict. But as you'll all understand already from what I've just said, it's clearly illegal to target civilians with white phosphorus because you can't target civilians with anything. And it's also, I mean, white phosphorus should only be used in very, very limited situations against any human being, including members of the military. And that is because there is a prohibition on weapons which cause unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury. And white phosphorus, as we saw again from those very graphic images, causes, I mean, there is no need to cause that kind of injury in order to, to reduce the forces of your opponent. And I'm aware as I'm saying this, that this highlights another element of international humanitarian law, which is that it's slightly gruesome, like some terrible things are allowed. So shooting directly at soldiers is allowed, and even in some cases, the use of white phosphorus. So it can be a little confusing to people who are interested in protection of civilians and support of human rights to hear the parameters of international humanitarian law. But in any case, those things I've described are prohibited by international humanitarian law. So if they are prohibited, well, what can be done? There are two possible avenues for redress, legally speaking. So serious violations of international humanitarian law amount to war crimes, which then entail individual criminal responsibility, right? So they can be criminal offences which can be prosecuted. And it's very important to record and preserve evidence of violations, even if there is no immediately obvious forum for a criminal prosecution. So this is something that we've seen being increasingly recognised by the international community. And in the last few years, a number of mechanisms have been established to gather evidence of international crimes, even though there's no obvious forum to prosecute them. For example, in the case of Syria, which, as we know, has been a really terrible forum for atrocity crimes. So the UN has set up an international, impartial, independent mechanism for Syria, which essentially is a UN body that collects evidence from NGOs, from doctors, from individuals, from monitoring missions, and collects them and preserves them according to legal standards and puts together indictments against individuals or potential indictments against individuals in the event that those individuals fall into the hands of someone who can prosecute them. And The principle of universal jurisdiction means that war crimes can be prosecuted anywhere in the world. They don't have to be prosecuted in the country in which they occurred or in the country of nationality of the perpetrator. So if those individuals turn up anywhere, prosecution can be undertaken. And in the case of Syria, for example, such a prosecution is currently underway in Germany. There are another couple of examples as well. So that's international humanitarian law and responsibility for war crimes. The second avenue involves international human rights law. So international human rights law applies both in war and in peacetime. International humanitarian law only applies in armed conflict. And it regulates how states behave towards those in their territory or otherwise under their jurisdiction. It's possible that both Azerbaijan and Armenia have jurisdiction, so have human rights responsibilities over the Nagorno Karabakh region. I say it's possible, there's a whole conversation there, it's interesting, it depends what act we're talking about, right? The relevant rights in the case of the stories we've heard today would include then rights to life, rights to health, and the prohibition on torture and inhumane. And it is possible to claim that a state has breached, for example, the right to life by violating international humanitarian law. In other words, the international humanitarian law violations we just discussed, the prohibition on targeting civilian objects, the use of weapons causing unnecessary suffering, those can be the basis for a human rights claim. And why is that important? Because there are actually fora in which those claims can be made. In particular, of course, as you'll know, both Azerbaijan and Armenia are party to the European Court of Human Rights. And some people in the audience may already be involved with claims at the European Court of Human Rights because there have been some claims related to this conflict already initiated. And I'd also briefly mention, as very relevant in this respect, the ruling 10 days ago, which the European Court handed down in the case of Georgia versus Russia, in which it found that Russia had violated the rights of occupants of South Ossetia through its actions in the 5-day war there back in 2008. So through violations of international humanitarian law. So it's very relevant to this situation. Another thing that's worth noticing is that that conflict was in 2008 and the European Court handed its ruling down 10 days ago. So I'm afraid that's a cautionary note about how long those proceedings take. So finally, and I'll wrap up so we have time for questions briefly here, what are the obligations on the international community to act in the face of documented violations of international humanitarian or human rights law? In other words, I've talked about the obligations on the states involved in the conflict. What about other states who are witnesses? Are there obligations on them to act? Well, there are some. There are both obligations to prevent and obligations to punish. And the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention and the Torture Convention all contain provisions which are useful here. I mean, within their own terms. So the Genocide Convention, of course, only applies in the case of a genocide. The Geneva Conventions is during armed conflict, and the Torture Convention obviously regulates torture. So parties who sign up to the Geneva Conventions, which regulate armed conflict, commit not only to respect the conventions themselves, but to ensure respect for them. And many argue, for example, the International Committee of the Red Cross would argue that this means they have a duty to act in respect to behaviour of other states as well. So if you signed up to the conventions, the ICRC would argue you're actually signing up to ensure that everyone else who signed up to conventions respects their provisions. More specifically, each state that signs up to the Geneva Conventions is obliged to search for persons alleged to have committed serious breaches of the convention and either prosecute themselves or extradite them to another state for prosecution. And a similar provision to that appears in the Torture Convention. And in the case of genocide, parties to the Genocide Convention specifically undertake both genocide. That's the key article in the Genocide Convention. And that's actually been held by the International Court of Justice to mean that it applies to every state with a capacity to influence the actions of persons likely to commit or already committing genocide. So there's an obligation on states to prevent genocide anywhere in the world. So there is a legal basis both for prevention and punishment on third-party states. The obligation to prevent is arguably the most important and certainly the most elusive in practice. The obligation to punish is more clearly defined and perhaps politically easier. But perhaps separating those two out is an artificial distinction in any case, as holding perpetrators responsible is a crucial part of deterring the commission of future crimes. And lack of accountability has been identified clearly as a risk factor for the future commission of atrocity crimes. And I think that brings me back to where I started and the importance of documenting and preserving evidence of violations and the crucial role that doctors can play in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that and for drawing together all that we've heard and reminding us of the role of doctors as witnesses. We've had a number of questions and we have just about 15 minutes. So I think what I will do is lay out the questions, some of which are more relevant for some panelists than others, and then invite each of you to take maybe 2 to 3 minutes to think through what you might want to share with the audience in response. And I will start with just a comment. So this one is not so much to respond, but just for all of us to know that on the topic of doctors as witnesses, one of our participants, Susan Jerian, invites anyone who's witnessed atrocities that occurred in Artsakh to write reports and share their eyewitness testimony and photographic evidence, as we have done today on this panel to enlighten all of us who are in the audience, but here in a more purposive way as evidence, which is being collected at Columbia University Institute for the Study of Human Rights as an online repository of evidence. And so to the extent possible to also consolidate, and actually many of us are working in this direction. There are some efforts in that direction here in Los Angeles as well, but the idea of taking these testimonies and collecting them is a great one. But in terms of questions, we have a range. One is whether anyone might comment on the degree to which medical aid providers were specifically targeted by Azerbaijan. Was there any evidence of that? Did anyone experience that? Any, of course, panelist is welcome to answer that question. And then another question, and this one seems more directed to Kate, what is the use of laws and treaties if they do not have the power to stop aggressors who fail to respect those laws? And I think maybe under connecting this to those responsibilities with which you ended your contribution would be great. And then a broad question that I'm sure is on the minds of many of our audience members and that each of you might respond to is, how can those of us not in the medical field be of assistance and support on the ground or from here, from the United States? And actually, maybe we might broaden that even further to connect it to the idea Kate put on the table of much more broadly what is to be done. What are the avenues of contribution? How might people think about strategies going forward that may both address the humanitarian crisis that we've just heard described, but also think through responsibilities of prevention and protection. And now we do have some questions flooding in. So, you know, an additional question is whether or not anybody understands the Azeris to have weaponized biological agents in their munitions. So this might go further than white phosphorus and ask if there are other kinds of prohibited weapons that may have been used. And finally, given the scale of the humanitarian tragedy and the role of the Azeri government, what more can be done by human rights NGOs, democratic governments? Has there been disparate treatment of this case as compared to other comparable cases? And so here, Kate, perhaps you might be able to help us think that one through as well. So with that, I'm going to turn back to the panelists, thanking the audience for these excellent questions. And again, giving everybody 2 to 3 minutes to respond so that we are able to hear from all of you in response to these questions.
Sure. I think well, there's a lot I could say on this topic, but I think one of the first things, just coming back to sort of the medical providers, Shant alluded to it. We know that we've had ambulances that were targeted. We just, again, coming back to sort of looking at the law and what it looks like, how well marked were they? What did those vehicles look like? But we also know that hospitals were definitely targeted and what that looks like. And as Kate was talking about, we also know that civilians, by the way, have also been imprisoned or taken, and they're gone missing. So there's sort of all of these issues when we're talking about humanitarian law and what does it actually mean and how well do we document. But I also want to state, I think one of the questions came back to the idea of why was there such silence from the international arena, knowing that some of these laws, and sorry, Kate, maybe it's a question back again, but knowing that these things are documented, that these conventions do exist, that many of these countries have signed all of them, maybe not the treaty we're talking about for munitions, but really some of the others. what was sort of that world? How did that happen? And we see it globally. And what is it that we could do in thinking about from this panel as medical providers, public health providers, but larger? So going back to sort of that larger umbrella.
Haig.
I think it's a good set of questions. Honestly, like a lot of these things are a little difficult to answer, I'm going to be honest. And I say that because of the things that we've already experienced as a nation with regards to humanitarian violations. The fact that we've gone through a genocide that's not recognized yet is kind of a symbol as to probably, unfortunately, where a lot of these humanitarian initiatives are going to go. And that's kind of depressing, I will be honest, but it's something for us to kind of inflect on ourselves. I think the first thing as a people that we need to do is hold on to that unity that we so strive. I think once we come to a point where the country and the diaspora are one, where there is no difference between the two, where instead of people asking, what can I do? They just go and help the country. And once we have this kind of unity, it'll be a lot more easy to approach some of these humanitarian issues. There were some questions about like biologic warfares and things like that. I don't think it leapt to the point of like actual, like biologics, biologics being things like sarin gas or, like very inhumane ways to, do war. White phosphorus by itself was an inhumane way to go to war. Like to burn alive without being able to stop the fire is ridiculous. So, I think they committed enough humanitarian, issues, but it's the same with the cluster munitions. Like, why would you get to a point where you would need to not target the people that you want to hurt? Like, why would you get to that point? But in any case, I think the main thing here is to unite as a people and then start to think about how to approach some of these bigger humanitarian issues, is what I would say.
Salpy?
I think both Alina and Haig described it very nicely, the issues that we faced during the war. Yeah, they did target hospitals. They even targeted maternity hospital. I mean, I understand you're targeting a hospital where they're treating the soldiers, but why children and the mothers? I think, and this has all been documented, I'm sure, with the human rights in Artsakh and Armenia, but it's endless. And I think I have a difficult time still absorbing all that stuff for me to be able to express it. But Shant was very involved with Ministry of Health, both in Armenia and the Artsakh, and he probably has a lot of details about exactly how many physicians and physicians we lost or nurses, because I know we lost some. But probably Shant will be a better person to give you more detailed information on that.
And Shant, before you respond, I'm just going to add one more question that came, which is, in addition to the generic and broad question of how can any of us help, or what are avenues for us to contribute from here or on the ground, there was a more narrow question about nurses in particular and what nursing assistance might look like, and if there are opportunities, and if nurses have played a significant role here.
Sure, though maybe I may ping pong that back to Salpy, who comes from a nursing background. But let me try to answer this question about how can we get involved and what can we do, at least on the medical / healthcare side. And the answer is absolutely. There is a huge role for everyone, and I say this frequently in that we as the clinical people may very well be the front line in providing some of this aid, but we all have to realize that healthcare and provision of healthcare is a big undertaking, and it involves the involvement, or sorry for the redundancy, but it takes a lot of people other than clinicians to be involved to do this right. And so for those that are interested in doing something, I would, or being a part of some of the healthcare initiatives that are going on or that will go on, I would say, do not be discouraged by the fact that you're not a nurse, you're not a doctor, you're not a dentist or something like that. We need to look at these issues on a more comprehensive level. We need the input of someone who comes from an IT background, for example, to help Salpy with developing the platform to improve the supply chain of donations that came in, for example. We need the people with a music background to help with music therapy, to help with the mental health issues. We need marketing people, we need everyone. And so I think that this is really a team effort, and I would encourage anyone who's listening or has specifically asked these questions to get a hold of any of us on the panel. We have a lot of projects, we have a lot of initiatives, we would like to do more and more. And so there's absolutely an opportunity to be involved with all of this. One of the questions I saw, sorry, Asla, I'm taking a sneak peek here, also asked about how the actual needs on the ground and those perceived by the Armenian diaspora aligned. I think that's, it's a great question. It was not perfect. There's a lot of opportunity to improve, and there is where we need a lot more people to help us do that. You don't have to be a doctor or a nurse to think about how we can better align Armenia and diaspora when it comes to humanitarian response. And by the way, when we talk about humanitarian response, I always tell the students, this is, to me, it's like an 80-20 rule. 20% of what we do at that time is sort of necessary or we need for surge capacity, but 80% of the outcome that we will see at the end has to do with how healthy the system is going into any of these emergencies. There is no way we can have a perfect response to any humanitarian crisis if our healthcare system in our setting is ill or is not in optimal shape. And so, and we will have to go back to that. After the 6 weeks, there are the other, tens and hundreds of weeks where there is no war, but that this is our opportunity to build a healthcare system so that it could respond more effectively for the next crisis, whether it's man-made or natural.
Thank you, Shant. Kate, I'm going to give you just 2 to 3 minutes because we are now quite short on time.
Absolutely. So what's the point of law? That's always a good question. It's clearly not, law does not solve problems, but I personally, in my lifetime and in my engagement with these laws, have seen significant steps forward in terms of protection and rules-based legal order. And for example, the fact that in any situation of atrocity or conflict, human rights abuse, the question of accountability is immediately on the table now, always. I mean, even if there is no accountability, the question of accountability is there. And that quite simply did not used to be the case. Did not used to be the case. Before the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the creation of the International Criminal Court, people just threw their hands up and accepted that there would be no accountability. So, that in itself is a step forward. Just the fact that, we saw with the narrative about this conflict, and we see it with all conflicts, the parties deny doing certain things, right? And they accuse the others of things that they think are bad. So there is a consensus on stuff that's not allowed. They might do some of it, but they deny doing it. And one can only assume that that's operating some kind of restraint. It's hard to know how much, of course, because you can't tell, what isn't happening because of those rules. And I think it's important, at least it's important for somebody who does what I do or what Asla does, to be somewhat optimistic and to hold on to those positive signs and those small steps forward. And things like, Syria has been this terrible, we talked about disparate situations, and I'll stop here. I think it's very hard to compare, but Syria has been obviously a tragic failure of the international community, and violence on the most horrific scale, and that's action on that is blocked at the Security Council, by Russia and China. And then there was this creative idea that came out of the UN General Assembly to gather all the evidence. Like, people have a lot of evidence, so we're going to gather it, and we're actually going to help nation states individually who think that this is a big deal and want to do something about it. We're going to help them prosecute and hold people accountable in a way that bypasses the whole Security Council block. So I think it's important to see these things. I mentioned the ruling against Russia from the European Court 10 days ago. That is a big deal. that the European Court has ruled against Russia over that conflict. I mean, notice these things, you know, and get energy from them, and keep educating yourself and speaking out about violations, because that helps entrench them in the consciousness, and then, you know, hopefully also in political reality.
I can't resist just adding one word, which is, you know, there are massive asymmetries in the international system. It's shot through the system as a whole, and whose violations and whose suffering is marked and seen is very much driven by those asymmetries. So one way that almost everyone in this audience and anybody who has been paying attention to this conflict very likely is already contributing is by your outrage at what's happened in Artsakh and Nagorno Karabakh. The fact of a very mobilized diaspora, the fact that there are voices that are embedded in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere in the corridors of power demanding justice, however slowly it might come, is part of the story of accountability. So your very presence at this panel is likely to be a contribution towards accountability, because you've just learned about a conflict you may not have known as much about or in this level of detail, and you now have the capacity to yourself be mobilized. And so I do want to really underscore that we do have power by virtue of the existence of these laws to hold those who are powerful to account, even in the midst of those asymmetries to which you've pointed. But with that, let me turn to Alina for our concluding remarks.
Thank you so much for that, Asa. That was amazing. And just bringing it back to health, which is sort of our world, really thinking about kind of what Shant also talked about, as well as Salpy and Haig. The idea of health is much bigger than the absence of disease, right? It's not just a clinical model. It's really looking at physical, mental, social, psychosocial welfare, right? And what does that mean? So I think realizing that anybody who wants to be involved, we cannot be healthy unless we have employment, unless we have education, unless we have housing, unless we have law and civility, and really thinking about all of that in the larger context. And what we need to do moving forward in Artsakh is going to be harder than pretty much what we've done up to this point, right? And really thinking about that larger planning and programming that needs to be done. With that said, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank the Promise Armenian Institute and the Promise Institute of Human Rights for sponsoring this event. A special thank you to our esteemed panelists, our event organizers, but most of all, thank you all for being here and for placing the deserved significance on such an important matter. Again, thank you all. Have a fabulous afternoon, but most importantly, stay well.